In the forgotten corners of Asia, where mountains sleep under clouds and rivers remember blood, there are stories too old for paper, too cursed for prayer. Welcome to folk fear, where the dead still whisper, and tradition hides its darkest truths beneath silk and bone. Tonight, we return to a village swallowed by time, a place where love turns to ash and the living become vessels for the vengeful dead. They say every family in the mountains of Phìn Lùng keeps the bones of their dead close, tucked in clay jars beneath the floorboards, sealed with red thread and ash, so the spirits may guard the living. But what if the spirits do not wish to protect? What if they remember betrayal? What if the jars are not sealed to keep them safe, but to keep them in? This is the tale of Widow Sum, a woman who loved too many times and buried each husband's soul in a jar, and her granddaughter, Ling, who heard the jars begin to scream. The fog clung to the mountains like a burial shroud. It drifted through the crooked trees and blanketed the terraced hills of Phìn Lùng, a village carved into the bones of northern Vietnam. The air smelled of wet earth and incense long since extinguished, and the only sound that broke the stillness was the distant cry of a crow, sharp, guttural, and far too late in the season. Ling clutched her worn satchel tighter as the bus disappeared behind her, leaving only muddy tire tracks and the faintest trace of exhaust in the mist. She stood alone on the edge of a dirt path, staring up at the steep slope where the thatched roof of her grandmother's house barely peeked through the trees. She hadn't been here in 10 years. The last time she was barely old enough to remember the village, just fragments, the flicker of oil lamps, the scent of bitter herbs drying on bamboo racks, and the icy hand of her grandmother guiding her to the altar room with whispered warnings to never touch the jars. Now 17 and orphaned, Ling had nowhere else to go. The walk to the house was steep and slick. Wet leaves stuck to her shoes, and shadows slithered between the trees as though they breathed. There were no children playing, no old men smoking by the roadside. Just stillness, a village preserved in silence, like a corpse dressed for company. At the top of the hill, the wooden house looked exactly as she remembered it, slanted, sun-worn, and half swallowed by moss. Ivy twisted up the stilts. The front gate creaked without wind. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look lived in either. Ling knocked. Once. Twice. No answer. The door groaned open on its own. She hesitated. The air that spilled out was cold, impossibly so, as though the house exhaled winter. And then she stepped inside. Everything smelled of old paper, mothballs, and something faintly sweet, like rot hidden under sugar. The interior was dim, the light barely filtering through the oiled parchment windows. Wooden beams above her head sagged with time. Beneath her, floorboards creaked like breath held too long. "Ba?" she called, voice shaking. From deeper in the house came a rustle, a thud, and then a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. Ling froze. Then a voice, raspy, thin as rice paper. "Ling, child, is that you?" She turned toward the hallway. A shape emerged, hunched, skeletal, wrapped in layers of black cloth. Widow Sam. Her skin had yellowed with age, stretched too tight across her cheekbones, and her eyes, once the color of night, now looked like clouds before a storm. "You have grown," Sam whispered, "and you came. Good girl. Come, come, this house has missed you." Ling didn't answer. Her voice had caught somewhere in her throat, tangled in a knot of dread. Something about her grandmother's presence felt heavier now, like the air had warped around her. Some led her to the small back room where a bamboo cot lay on the floor. No mattress, no pillow, just folded cloth and a blanket that smelled faintly of old smoke. "You'll sleep here," Some said, "close to the floor. It's warmer that way." That night the fog wrapped tight around the house. No stars, no wind, no sound beyond the chirp of frogs in the distance and the occasional snap of something unseen in the trees. Ling lay awake, staring up at the low wooden ceiling. And then she heard it. A whisper, faint, just beneath her. At first she thought it was the house settling, but then it came again, a breathless murmur, words too soft to catch, drifting up between the floorboards. It didn't stop, it didn't change, it simply repeated, as though someone was reciting something over and over in the dark, buried beneath her sleeping mat. She pressed her ear to the floor. The wood was cold, unnaturally cold, and the whispering grew louder. Not one voice, several, all whispering in different rhythms, overlapping like wind through a broken flute. One voice stuttered, one hissed, one wept. Her heart raced. She pulled back and sat up, drenched in sweat. She told herself it was wind, nothing more. She told herself she was tired, disoriented, afraid of her new surroundings. But the whispering never stopped. It continued until the sky began to lighten, and only then, with the rooster's first cry, did the house fall silent again. In the morning, Sam acted as though nothing was wrong. She handed Ling a bowl of bitter porridge and motioned toward the back of the house. "Chop wood, sweep the altar room. The ancestors are restless." The altar room. Ling remembered it from childhood, a place she had only entered once on the 7th night of her grandfather's death. It had felt suffocating then. It felt worse now. The room was tucked behind a faded curtain near the rear of the house. Inside it was darker than the rest. The air hung still. Wooden beams wrapped in red cloth loomed above an altar stained black with decades of incense smoke. And beneath the altar, a low wooden platform. Carved into it were 7 small compartments, each the size of a rice pot, with round lids made of aged clay. 6 were sealed shut, marked with flaking red wax. 1 had no lid. She bent down. The open space was empty, or so she thought, until she saw something glimmer in the dust. A single human tooth. Small, browned at the root, split down the middle like it had cracked under great heat. She gasped and stepped back. Her breath caught. The same whispering from the night before returned, only now it came not from the floor, but from the altar itself, a low chorus, just beneath the edge of hearing. Ling turned and fled the room, but even in daylight, even as birds chirped and the village stirred with unseen life, the sound followed her. That night she tried to sleep in another corner of the house, near the hearth, close to the front door. But the whispers still came. This time they said her name, softly, over and over. Ling, Ling, Ling. She cried out, ran to her grandmother's room. Some sat up, eyes already open, waiting. "You hear them now," some said. Ling trembled. "What are they?" Sam's mouth twitched into something between a smile and a grimace. "Not what, child?" She reached out and touched Ling's chest, her fingers like claws. "Who?" She said nothing else that night, and Ling didn't sleep again. By the third day, the whispers had grown louder, more distinct. Ling began to hear names: Ming, Dao, Tuan, each name like a tear in fabric, peeling back the veil of silence. Each name followed by breathing, shallow, labored, as though someone were trapped beneath the floorboards, lungs full of ash. She started seeing shadows move where light should fall, reflections that didn't match her movements. And every time she passed the altar room, the open space beneath it, the one where the tooth had been, seemed larger, as if it were waiting for something, something with her name already carved into it. The mornings in Phìn Lùng were deceptive. The sun rose late behind layers of mist, and the light that did reach the village came filtered through a veil of white. Everything looked softened, almost gentle, as if the horrors of the night had only been a trick of shadows and fevered dreams. But Lin knew better. The whispers had followed her into waking, and worse still, they had begun speaking clearly, sometimes in words she understood, other times in a language that made her stomach churn and her gums ache. They were getting closer. She felt them now, not just beneath the floorboards, but in the walls, in the corners of her eyes, in the heatless draft that licked the back of her neck when no windows were open. The house didn't creak like old wood, it breathed. That morning, her grandmother said nothing. Some moved through the house with her usual quiet grace, spooning bitter roots into boiling water, folding dried leaves into linen packets, muttering chants Lin couldn't quite make out. Her eyes never looked directly at Lin anymore. It was as if she saw through her, or perhaps past her, toward something that hadn't yet arrived. Lin didn't eat. She couldn't. Her mouth was dry, her chest tight. She kept glancing back toward the altar room, toward the open compartment beneath the altar. She had to look again, even though every instinct screamed to stay away. The air inside the altar room had changed. It wasn't just cold now. It was thick, like standing in a room that had been sealed for years. Dust floated through the slots of light like ash. The bowls remained untouched, the portraits unchanged, but the open space beneath the altar, it called to her. She approached it slowly, knees trembling. The wood creaked beneath her bare feet. She knelt, hesitated, then reached forward and brushed away the dust from the rim of the empty compartment. Something caught beneath her fingernail, sharp, brittle. She pulled back and found a small scrap of bone, no longer than a sliver. Not wood, not shell. It was human. She knew it without needing to ask. Her stomach twisted, but her hand moved again, this time deeper, brushing the edges of the compartment. Her fingers met rough clay, a jar, unsealed. Lin's breath caught. The jar sat tucked into the dark, its round belly pressed against the wooden wall, as if hiding. It was the same size as the others, large enough to hold bones. But where the others bore thick red wax across their lids, sealed with thread and inked with Taoist glyphs, this one had no lid at all. Just a rim smeared with what looked like dried blood. And something else. A faint engraving scratched along the edge. She squinted. The words were almost worn away, but one name still remained. Lin. She fell backward with a cry, her hand scraping against the wood, smearing blood along the floor. And then the jar moved, just slightly, just enough to tip forward. The moment her blood touched the clay, something rippled through the air, a sound like a long, low exhale from beneath the floor. The bowls on the altar rattled, the red cloth hanging from the beams twitched, and from inside the jar, Lin swore she heard something stirring. Not words, not whispers, but breathing. A deep, wet breath, like lungs expanding for the first time in decades. She scrambled away, heart pounding, and ran back into the main room. Some was waiting. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply looked at Lin's bleeding hand and smiled. That night, the whispering grew bolder. It no longer hid in the cracks of silence. It swelled through the walls like wind through a flute. Names echoed. Footsteps sounded just beyond the doorway. At one point, she looked out the window and saw someone standing in the rice field, too tall to be real, swaying as if hung from a thread. But the worst came just after midnight. The jar began to weep. She heard it clearly from the altar room, a faint sobbing, broken, guttural, like a man choking on his own tongue. She crept closer, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The door to the altar room stood slightly ajar. From within, the sobbing turned into chanting. Not hers, not her grandmother's. A man's voice, low and fractured, chanting in broken verses, as if repeating the last words he spoke before death. The syllables were hoarse, foreign, smeared with pain. Lin stood frozen. Then something dragged across the floor inside, a wet scraping sound like skin on wood. And then silence. And then her name, whispered, closer now. Lin. Not from beneath the floor this time, from inside the jar. The next morning, Lin tried to confront her grandmother. "What is in that jar?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Some did not flinch. She simply looked at her, eyes blank, and said, "What belongs there?" "That's not an answer." Some set down her pestle and motioned toward the altar room. "Everything in this house has a place. The jars were never meant to be opened, but you touched it, you fed it, now it knows your name." Lin shook her head. "What do you mean, fed it?" Some's eyes narrowed. "Blood opens the path, and names close it again." Lin stared, horrified. "You knew I would come here. You left that jar open." Her grandmother didn't answer. Instead, she handed Lin a bundle wrapped in red silk. Inside were sticks of incense, a chicken bone, and a red thread coiled around a blackened charm that pulsed faintly with warmth. "What is this?" Lin whispered. "A key or a lock, depending on how you use it." She refused to go back to the altar room that day. But she couldn't avoid the house's new rhythm. The jar had become the center. The breath of the walls now moved with it, a slow inhaling and exhaling, like something sleeping just beneath. Doors opened themselves. Her reflection in the old mirror began to lag behind, blinking half a second too late. At night, She dreamed of a man burning alive in a clay pot, screaming not in pain but in love. His charred hands reached for her, his mouth moved without sound. But in the dream she knew his name, Tuon. And when she woke, she found the name carved on her arm, not with a blade, but as if etched from within. The skin wasn't broken, but it burned, and the letters would not fade. Lynn began to change. She felt it first in the way her breath fogged the mirror even when the air was warm. Her fingertips turned cold at night. Her dreams bled into her waking hours. She started hearing music, faint, mournful notes that played only when she was alone. One afternoon, she looked out the window and saw a row of blackened wedding robes swaying from the trees behind the house. When she ran outside, they were gone. But the next morning, one appeared folded on her bed. It smelled of smoke and rosewater. Inside its sleeve, she found a dried petal and a note written in a hand that trembled with longing. "Be my bride. Let me out." That night, she stood before the altar again. The 6th jar pulsed softly in the dark, a heartbeat made of clay and bone. She took the red thread, she took the charm, and for the first time, she whispered back, not in defiance, not in fear, but in recognition. She didn't know if she was speaking to a ghost, a demon, or something older than either, but the truth echoed inside her. The jar had not found her by accident. It had been waiting, just like she had been drawn back to this house, back to the lineage, back to the 6th name, the 6th bride, the 6th jar, now opened and empty, waiting for something to take its place. Long before Lynn's breath fogged the windows of the old house, before her name echoed from inside a jar, before the shadows beneath the floor learned to whisper again, there was some. Not the frail creature Lynn now called Ba, but a girl of 18, barefoot, beautiful, and bitter with grief. The year was 1964. The mountain winds howled harder in those days, and the village of Phìn Lùng was no less haunted, only quieter. That year Sum buried her second husband, Tao, a kind man with a weak heart. She'd found him cold and stiff in the morning, his mouth opened as if to speak, his eyes wide and glassy as rainwater. The elders said it was fate. Some said nothing. She had no tears left, not after losing men the year before, her first husband, a soldier, swallowed by mud and landmines. 2 husbands, 2 funerals, 2 spirit jars sealed with red thread, bone dust, and incense ashes. The shaman muttered chants to calm the souls, but something inside Some refused to mourn like the other widows. She did not sit beside the altar wailing into cloth. She did not wear black for a full moon cycle. She walked the house in silence, feeding the jars raw rice and fish bones, as if bargaining with something no one else could see. The villagers began to talk. She carries death like perfume. Men die under her roof. Bad luck has teeth, and they're hers. Some stopped going to market, stopped talking to her sister. She let the rice rot in its sacks, and she began to dream. The dreams came every night, beginning on the 7th day after Tao's death. A man stood at the edge of the forest, wrapped in black silk, his hands folded, his head bowed. He never moved, but when she woke, her fingers smelled of smoke, and there were red threads tangled in her hair. On the 13th night, she followed him, not in dream, in life. The wind that night was sharp and breathless, the moon just a slit of dull silver. She walked barefoot into the forest, dressed in her husband's funeral robe. Something guided her. A low sound, like a drum buried beneath the soil, pulsed with each step. She reached the banyan tree by the cliff's edge, and he was there. Tall, still, wrapped in a robe the color of dried blood. His face was shadowed beneath a wide conical hat, but she saw his mouth. It smiled like someone remembering pain. "You've come," he said, his voice like parchment curling over flame. "I dreamed you," she said. "No, I dreamed you." She hesitated. Her throat burned with unspoken grief. "I want them back, Min, Tao." "They are not yours to reclaim." "Then I want them to stay. I want their voices, their presence. I want to be loved and never left again." The man's grin deepened. "Love," he said, "is the beginning of rot. But if you crave what clings, not what flees, there are rituals and bindings and prices." She stepped closer. "Teach me." He tilted his head. "Then give me that which is untouched." She blinked. "I've given enough." "Not your grief, your womb." She flinched. "You want a child?" "No," he said. "I want the one that comes after." He opened his palm. Inside it, a coiled scroll inked in black worm blood. Characters pulsed faintly, alive even in the dark. "You will bear a child who hears the silence between breath, who speaks to bone and blood. That child will bind 7 spirits, 6 in love, the 7th in choice." Some hesitated. "What happens after 7? The man laughed, soft, cruel. "Then the circle closes and the house becomes whole." She took the scroll, unfolded it. The symbols bit into her fingers as she read. Her tongue turned black, her blood thickened, her spine ached. But she memorized every character, every whisper, every glyph of the Taoist ritual of eternal binding. The man pressed a clay charm into her hand, small, round, etched with 4 vertical teeth. "Each husband must die in passion, in longing, in fire or frost or silence, but always for you. Their bones must be ground with your hands. Their names must be whispered as the clay cools. Do not forget the names. And if I do, then the soul escapes, and so do the others." He stepped backwards into the mist. His final words coiled like steam around her ears. "Bind love, and you bind vengeance. They are the same ghost, wearing a different mask." Some returned before dawn. She lit the altar candles and ground the chicken bones to powder. She wrote her first glyph in pig blood and hung it above the first jar. Min. Then she reopened Tao's jar and whispered his name into the ashes, letting her tears fall freely for the first time. That night the dream stopped, but the breathing began. Over the next 20 years, 5 more men died under Sum's roof. All husbands, all lovers. Each one fell more in love than the last. Each one whispered promises of forever. and each one died a death soaked in longing. Some choked in their sleep, hearts swollen with grief after she stopped speaking to them. One leapt into the river after finding her wedding robe laid across another man's bed. One simply burned, though the house never caught fire. Only his bones remained, smiling inside the stove. The villagers stopped asking questions. They said nothing as some grew paler, richer, and stranger. Nothing as her garden bloomed out of season. Nothing as red thread began to appear tied around their doors after funerals. She gave offerings, she healed the sick, and still she kept the jars, each one sealed with wax and thread, each one buried beneath the altar. All but one. The seventh she left unsealed, because she knew Lin would come. She saw it the night her daughter was born, the child with black hair and pale hands who died within hours of birth. Some buried the body beneath the banyan tree and waited, and 9 months later, her daughter became pregnant with a child of her own, Lin, the one meant to finish the circle, the one born with breath that fogged summer mirrors, the one who spoke to ghosts in her sleep, the one with the 7th name already etched in her fate. Back in the present day, Lin woke gasping. Her mouth tasted of ash. Her hands were covered in clay. She looked down. She was kneeling at the altar. The 6th jar lay in front of her, open, still weeping, and in her lap sat the worm blood scroll. It was warm and breathing.
Ling no longer trusted sleep, not because of nightmares, but because when she woke, she was never in the same place. Sometimes she awoke kneeling in front of the altar, her fingers pressed to the 6th jar as though in prayer. Sometimes she found herself at the edge of the rice field, barefoot and shivering, with red thread tied around her wrists. Once she woke standing at the attic door, her breath fogging the wood, her lips moving silently as though reciting something ancient. But that morning was the worst, because she woke with ashes in her mouth, dry, coarse, bitter. Her tongue was black at the edges. She stumbled to the basin and scrubbed her teeth until her gums bled, but the taste of bone and smoke lingered like a warning behind her tongue. Downstairs, the house was silent. Some had left before sunrise. A note sat on the table. 3 words, scrawled in ink that bled into the paper. Don't open anything. But it was already too late. Ling had never dared enter the storage room at the far end of the hallway. It had always been locked, until today. The door stood ajar, as if something had nudged it open from within. She pushed it wider. Dust bloomed in the beam of morning light. The room was long and narrow, its ceiling low, the air thick with mold and old incense. Bamboo shelves lined the walls, stacked with folded robes, scrolls, dried herbs, and photographs. Hundreds of them. Black and white, yellowed with age, curling at the edges. And every single photo showed the same woman, Some. But not the version Ling knew. This Some was younger, radiant, dressed in wedding robes of every kind, Hmong, Vietnamese, Chinese. In one photo, she smiled beside a soldier. In another, she wept beside a man with calloused hands and an herbal pouch around his neck. In yet another, she was dressed in mourning black, but smiling still. Beside each photo was a name written in faded ink: Ming, Dao, Tuan, Hiao, Nam, Bao. 6 names, 6 men, 6 husbands, 6 deaths. Ling's knees buckled. These were not just spirits, they were lovers, and they had all died loving the same woman. That night they came, not as dreams, not as whispers, but as presences. Ling was lying on her mat, eyes wide in the dark, when the floorboards beneath her began to shift, not with footsteps, but with breath. The wood rose and fell like the chest of something sleeping or waiting. The wind outside stopped. The frogs stopped. Even the crickets fell silent. And then the air turned cold, so cold her skin burned. From the altar room, the 6th jar let out a low, guttural moan, and the door creaked open. Ling sat up. They were there. 6 silhouettes standing in the hallway, perfectly still, not floating, not translucent, just wrong. Each man was shaped by his death. The first had no feet, his legs ending in black stumps that hissed when they touched the floor. The second's mouth was wide and cracked, stuck in a scream he'd never finished. The third dripped ash from his hands, his skin charred and flaking like burnt paper. One was soaked, as if drowned, another missing his face entirely, with only a bloodless slit where eyes should be. The last looked almost whole, until Ling noticed his wedding robe was on fire, flames licking upward, with no smoke, no heat, just lightless fire that shimmered in the dark like sorrow made visible. None of them spoke, but Ling heard them, not with her ears, with her bones. She loved us, then left us. She promised forever. She used our names and took our breath. We are not at rest. One stepped forward, the one who burned but did not burn. He knelt slowly in front of her and opened his palm. Inside was a necklace, Ling's necklace, the one she had lost years ago and never found. She reached for it with trembling fingers, but the moment she touched it, the spirit collapsed into ash, and the others screamed, not in rage, but in despair, as if they had been this close to peace and failed again. When she awoke, the house had returned to silence, but the necklace was still clutched in her hand. Its chain was warm, and around her wrist a new red thread had been tied in a perfect knot. She ran to the altar room. The 6th jar was still open, but now something sat beside it. A new jar, smaller, smoother, empty, except for one thing etched into its clay: her name, Ling. She confronted her grandmother that afternoon. "You knew what they were." Some did not deny it. "You saw them." "They're not angry, they're in pain." Some looked down. "That is how love stays. They don't want to hurt me, they want to be heard. They want you to finish what I began." Ling stared at her, horrified. "I'm not you." "You will be, soon." Ling turned to leave. Sam's voice followed her. "You think this started with me? With those men? No. The village made me this way. The bones keep us safe. The jars keep the ancestors fed. And the house must always have a widow." That night, Ling did not sleep. She sat in front of the 6th jar, watched it, waited, and eventually, one by one, they came again. Not to haunt, not to harm, but to remember. Each spirit stepped forward and whispered into her ear, not words of warning, but memories, of when they first met Sam, of the way she laughed when pouring tea, of the songs she hummed as she washed her hair, of the night they died, eyes full of love, even as death reached for them. And then each one placed a finger to the sixth jar and vanished into the floor. Except the last. He looked at her with eyes full of sorrow and said, "The seventh jar is not for the dead, it's for the one who chooses." Then he was gone, and Ling was left alone in the dark, surrounded by whispers that no longer feared her name.
Ling stood at the edge of the village shrine, her hands trembling around a bundle of incense sticks. The wind hissed through the narrow trail behind her, carrying with it the distant chime of bells and the faint rustle of bamboo leaves. She had come to find answers, not from her grandmother, not from the spirits, but from the villagers, from the old blood who remembered when the rituals were still pure. The shrine sat atop a moss-covered rise overlooking the rice fields, its roof sagging, its lacquer peeled by time. And there, hunched on a wooden stool, was the village shaman, Tu. His face was a network of creases like cracked porcelain, and his eyes were as pale as candle smoke. He looked at Ling as if he had seen her before, or perhaps had been waiting for her. "You have the look," he said, without greeting. "The threads have touched you." Ling swallowed. "There are jars in her house, clay ones, with names." He nodded once, slowly. 6 names, and a 7th waiting. "I know." Ling stepped closer. "What are they?" "They are the wrong kind of jars. The kind that should never be made, let alone fed." "Fed?" He leaned forward, his breath scented with smoke and dried roots. "Every family in Phìn Lùng keeps the bones of their dead. It is our way. When one dies, the body is buried for 1 moon cycle, and then the bones are cleaned, dried, and placed in a hòn cốt jar, a soul vessel. We seal it with red wax, chant the name, tie it with thread. That way the soul remains close, watches over the bloodline." He paused. "But the jars in that house, they are not sealed, they are bound." Ling frowned. "What's the difference?" "Sealing honors, binding enslaves." He reached into the folds of his robe and pulled out a small, worn talisman, a red cloth square stitched with a sigil in dark ink. "A proper soul jar holds the bones with respect. No ash, no mixing, no burning. But your grandmother, she used the old rites, the banned ones. She mixed fire, blood, and name magic. She made each husband fall in love, made them die in longing, then used their final breath to tether their spirits, not to protect her, but to serve her." Ling felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. "So the men I saw? They are trapped, because love is the strongest thread of all, and betrayal turns that thread into a chain." Tu led her behind the shrine to a grove of trees where smoke-marked stones sat in a wide circle. Each stone bore a carving, symbols, not names. This is where the first jars were made, before the Taoists brought ink and thread, back when rituals were made of teeth and nails. He pointed to the ground. "This soil has drunk too much soul. It remembers." Then he turned to her, his expression darkening. "Your bloodline is not cursed, child. It is trained, from one woman to the next. Your grandmother did not break the chain. She fed it." Ling clenched her fists. "Can I end it?" He stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "There is only one way to break a binding jar. You must know all the names inside, and the seventh name must be your own." That night, back at the house, Ling didn't sleep. She sat before the altar with 6 sticks of incense, one for each jar. She lit them one by one. Ming, Dao, Duan, Nam, Yu, Bao. The air thickened. Shadows clung to the ceiling like cobwebs. Then she spoke her name aloud, Ling, and something shifted. The 7th jar, previously empty, now bore a faint crack around the rim. From within, a cold wind blew upward, swirling the incense smoke into a column that twisted toward the rafters. She felt it in her chest, a pull. Not pain, not fear, but recognition, as if the house itself had acknowledged her as the final offering. The next morning she went to the market, not to buy, but to observe. She watched old women thread red cord around bundles of bamboo shoots. She listened to gossip passed between vendors, stories of miscarried children, lost husbands, and whispers of how the air around Sam's house never warmed no matter the season. She passed a group of children playing near the stream and noticed one little girl holding a doll. The doll had no face, just a piece of cloth stitched where the mouth should be. Around its neck was a tiny charm shaped like a jar. Ling knelt beside the girl. "Where did you get that?" The girl pointed to the forest. "She gave it to me." "Who?" The girl looked confused. "The lady in the smoke." Later that evening, Ling followed the trail into the forest. The trees creaked above her like old bones. She walked until the wind fell silent and the birds stopped singing. And then she found it, a clearing. 7 small mounds, each with a faded red thread wound around a stone. At the center, a bowl of teeth, fresh, still damp with blood. Ling turned to run, but the wind behind her whispered, "Bride, return." She returned home to find the house darker than before. Sam sat by the hearth, holding a photo. It was of Ling's mother. "She tried to run too," Sam said, "but the jars follow the blood. You can't break what you were born to continue." Ling stepped forward. "I'm not her." Sam smiled faintly. "No, you're stronger. That's why the spirits chose you. That's why they whisper your name." Ling narrowed her eyes. "They don't want me to bind them. They want me to release them." Sam's faded. "Then they'll destroy you." Ling turned toward the altar. "Let them try." That night, she returned to the shrine alone. Tu was waiting, holding a bowl of crushed lotus root and ash. "The cleansing ritual is dangerous," she said. "You'll need hair, thread, name sigils, and bone dust from every jar. And if even one name is wrong, the spirits will be freed, but not at peace. They will turn on you." Ling nodded. "I'll take that chance." He gave her a long look, then handed her a dagger wrapped in cloth. "For the 7th jar," he whispered, "the one that bears your name, the one that must be filled with a piece of you." There was always one door in the house Lin had never opened. It sat at the end of the attic stair, nailed shut with thick, rusting iron nails, its wood darker than the rest of the house, warped, swollen with time, and sealed along the edges with red thread buried under lacquer. As a child, Lin had asked what was behind it. Her grandmother's reply had always been the same: "That room is not for the living." Now, that room was the only place left untouched by her footsteps.
which meant it was exactly where she needed to go. It was just after midnight when she made her move. The house groaned around her like an aging animal, but the whispers were quieter tonight, almost waiting. She climbed the stairs in silence, carrying a small oil lamp and the dagger Ong Tu had given her, now wrapped in black cloth. At the top of the steps, the door loomed like a sealed tomb. 7 iron nails lined the center seam, 7 like the jars, 7 like the names. The red thread was still there, bristle and crumbling, sealed into the wood. Lin touched one of the nails. It burned. She bit her lip, raised the hammer, and drove the iron out with one heavy strike. The sound echoed like thunder. One by one, she pulled them out until the door sagged in its frame. And then it opened. The smell hit her first. Dust, yes. Mold, yes. But beneath that, the scent of burnt silk, dried blood, and incense long since expired. The room was not large, but it was packed wall to wall with the past. No windows, just a shrine at the far end, and lining the walls on either side were effigies. Not dolls, not statues. Figures, human-sized. Each one crafted from bone, cloth, and fragments of the real. There were 6, each dressed in full wedding attire, each seated with their backs straight and their hands folded in their laps, each facing a tall, cracked mirror that ran the length of the back wall. Lin stepped closer, the flame of her lamp flickering as if the air itself trembled. She looked at the first effigy. Its robe was army green, tattered but carefully preserved. In its lap was a photograph, a young man in uniform, Min. The second wore an herbalist's apron stained with dried petals and leaves. The third had a charcoal mark across its cheek, as if fire had once kissed it. She moved down the line. Dao, Tuan, Hiao, Nam. Each effigy preserved like a groom waiting at an altar that never arrived. And then she saw the 7th space, empty, except for a folded robe neatly laid out on a wooden bench. The robe was red, trimmed in gold, the same wedding robe she had seen in her dream. And beside it, a headless effigy, half-finished. Its arms hung loosely. Its chest bore a stitched heart in black thread, but it was the necklace around its neck that froze Lin in place. Her necklace, the one given to her by her mother, lost in the river, found again in the hand of the burning spirit. She stepped back, her lamp shaking in her hand, and then the mirror cracked. Not from heat, not from time, but from inside. A fracture split across the glass, and behind it, something moved. A ripple, a shape, a figure with a face she knew too well. Her own, but older, colder, smiling. The effigies began to weep, a dry, papery sound like ash falling onto stone. Their heads tilted toward her, one by one, until all 6 were looking at the empty space between them, then at her. And from their mouths came a single word, not spoken, etched. It echoed in her mind, bride. Lin stumbled backward, the door slamming shut behind her. The flame of her lamp snuffed out, and in the darkness she heard breathing. Not hers, 7 breaths, surrounding her, growing louder, and then the sound of something being stitched, thread pulled through flesh, knot by knot. She woke on the floor. The door was still shut behind her, the effigies were still, but now the 7th figure had a head, a porcelain mask in the shape of her face,
and its stitched mouth smiled with red thread. Downstairs, her grandmother was waiting. "I told you that room was not for the living." Lin's voice trembled. "What is that place?" "The altar before the altar," some said softly, "where names are bound to memory, where the living meet the dead halfway." Lin clenched her fists. "You made them wait for you. You made them suffer." "I gave them what they asked for. Forever." Lin's voice broke. "And me? What do I get?" Some's eyes did not waver. "You get to finish what I began." That night, the sixth jar screamed. It did not whisper. It screamed. And from within came a flood of shadows, the faces of men in agony, arms reaching upward, mouths full of fire and water and ash. They poured into the house like smoke, filling every crevice, curling around Lin's bed. And then the effigies began to walk. Their joints cracked with every step. Their heads twisted unnaturally. They circled her, each one holding a piece of cloth, fragments of the wedding robe, now soaked in something dark. And in the center, the seventh effigy opened its mouth. From within, a voice not hers, but wearing her breath. "Make me whole." The next morning, Lin did not speak. She sat in silence at the altar, surrounded by ashes, incense, and the hum of names she could no longer separate from her own thoughts. Her reflection moved differently now. Her breath fogged the glass even in the sun, and the house no longer creaked. It whispered. Her name, their names, all of them. Together, bound, waiting.
It began just after sunset. The moment the final thread of red light disappeared behind the hills, the sixth jar began to vibrate. Softly at first, like a bowl disturbed by wind. Then harder, more violently, until it rattled the altar stones and sent a thin crack crawling down the wall behind it. Lin was sitting across the room, clutching the charm Ong-Tu had given her, sweat beading on her neck despite the cold. The jar wouldn't stop moving. And then it began to scream. Not the wail of a ghost, not the cry of a grieving widow, but something worse. It was the sound of a man being burned alive, reliving his final breath over and over, a scream that had forgotten how to end. It twisted through the walls of the house like fire through dry leaves. Some didn't flinch. She sat calmly beside the hearth, sipping bitter root tea, staring into the flames. "You fed it?" she said without looking up. Lin's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter. It knows your name now. It's inside the thread." The screaming rose in pitch. Glass shattered somewhere deep in the house, a mirror maybe, or something else breaking that should have stayed whole. Lin stood, heart hammering. "I have to stop it." "You can't. Not anymore." But Lin was already running. The altar room felt like a furnace. The air shimmered with heatless waves, and the clay jars glowed faintly as if lit from within. Smoke curled from their seams, and the scent of scorched silk filled her lungs. The sixth jar sat in the center of it all, split down the side, its crack weeping a thick tar-like substance that steamed when it touched the floor. And from the open mouth of the jar, a hand was reaching out. Blackened, flesh fused to bone, trembling, and gripping something tightly in its fist. A strip of red cloth, soaked through. Lin stepped forward, shaking. "Who are you?" The jar answered with another scream, but this time, buried inside it, was a word. Not clear, but unmistakable. "Lin." The hand dropped the cloth. It landed at her feet. It was part of her childhood dress, the one her mother had sewn by hand, the one she had lost by the river when she was 5. Unmistakable. Impossible. Lynn staggered back. The house shuddered. Behind her, the wooden floorboards warped and snapped, groaning as though something beneath them had begun to push upward. And then, a voice, not from the jar, but from everywhere, whispered, "You opened the door. Now it wants your breath." Some stood at the threshold, unmoved. Her face was a mask of calm. "You're part of the altar now. You can't leave until the circle completes." "I didn't ask for this." "No one does, but it always finds a bride." Lynn backed away, tears in her eyes, the charm in her hand growing hot. "I saw the 7th effigy. It looks like me." Some nodded. "It is you." Lynn's voice broke. "Why me?" "Because I never named the 7th. I couldn't. I thought I could bind the 6th and bury the curse, but the spirits wanted balance. They needed a final name, and I was too much of a coward to give them mine own." She looked Lynn in the eye. "So I gave them yours instead." The house moaned. The hand from the jar clawed at the floor, dragging bone against wood, and with it came a voice, no longer screaming, but begging, "Let me finish. Let me hold her. Let me breathe." Lynn ran. She sprinted through the house, her fingers brushing the walls as she passed. Each plank felt alive, pulsing beneath her touch. The house wasn't just haunted. It was becoming something alive. She burst into the attic, desperate for air, for escape, for anything that wasn't chanting or thread or jars. And there, in the corner, she found something new. A mirror. One she didn't remember. Its glass was black, its frame carved with symbols she didn't recognize. And in its reflection, she was not alone. Lynn turned, but the room behind her was empty. Yet, in the mirror, 7 figures stood behind her, each one cloaked in smoke, each one holding a piece of her, a strand of hair, a sliver of bone, a whispered memory. The 7th figure, taller than the rest, stepped forward and pressed its hand to the inside of the mirror, and Lynn felt it. Like fingers against her heart, a sensation of something entering, softly, gently, like silk soaked in blood. And then, everything shattered. She woke up in her bed. The house was quiet again. Morning light filtered through the cracks. No smoke, no screams, just the soft hum of birdsong and the rustle of wind in the bamboo. But something was wrong. Her arms were bruised. Her hands were stained with ash, and her reflection once again didn't follow her movements. It blinked a moment too late, smiled when she didn't, and whispered when she was silent. Downstairs, Some was gone. Only a letter sat at the table, written in red ink, the handwriting familiar, almost identical to Lynn's own. "I told them your name because mine was too heavy. Forgive me. You are the 7th because you are strong enough to end it. Some." Lynn lit the incense at the altar that night alone. The 6th jar was cracked and empty. The red cloth lay folded beside it. She placed it inside, tied it shut with the thread she had once worn around her wrist as a child, and spoke 7 names: Ming, Dao, Tuan, Nam, Yao, Bao, and finally, Lin. The floor rumbled, the jars rattled, and for one long moment the house exhaled, a deep, mournful sigh, and then silence. No screams, no whispers, just the echo of something that had waited too long to rest,
finally folding into the dark. But that night, as Lin slept, the empty seventh jar shifted on its own, and from inside, the faint sound of thread being pulled through cloth. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the kind of silence that waits, the kind that presses close to your skin and listens when you breathe, the kind that doesn't blink. For 3 nights, Lin heard nothing from the jars, no screams, no chants, no footsteps beneath the floor. But her body had changed. She no longer felt cold. Even when she stepped outside barefoot in the early mist, dew soaking into her skin, the chill did not touch her. The villagers still wore layers, still huddled around fires, but Lin felt warm, even when it rained. At first, she thought it was relief, that the spirits had passed through her and left. But then, the bruises began. Not from injury, not from struggle. They formed while she slept. Perfect circles, pale and ash gray. One at her shoulder, another on her wrist, a third near her ribs, where her heart fluttered at night for no reason at all. Each one shaped like a fingerprint. By the 5th night, she no longer slept. Not because she was afraid, but because her dreams were too real. She walked through them fully aware, barefoot on temple stone, draped in red silk that never wrinkled, breathing in smoke that smelled like old prayers. Sometimes she heard her own voice speaking in languages she didn't understand. Other times she saw shadows of men standing in the corners of her vision, watching her with quiet reverence. Not tormentors, suitors. She woke one morning with dried rice in her hair and a smear of red wax on her lip. There was no explanation, only the ever-growing feeling that she was no longer just herself. She began to speak names aloud without realizing it. Ming, Dao, Tuan, Nam, Hu, Bao. Her tongue folded around them as easily as if they were her own memories. She remembered the way Tuan smelled of cinnamon bark and earth after rain, the way Nam had held a flute in trembling fingers, playing soft melodies that no longer existed. She remembered the sound of Hugh's laughter, the curve of Bao's handwriting, and most of all, the way Ming had cried when he saw some in her wedding robe for the first time. But these were not Lin's memories. She had never met these men. She had never loved them. And yet she mourned them, like widows mourn lovers taken too soon. The 7th jar, once empty, now sat sealed. Lin didn't remember sealing it, but it no longer wept, and her name was gone from the surface. In its place, a symbol had formed, a spiral drawn in dried blood and thread, a sigil of final binding. She showed it to Ong Tu. The old shaman paled when he saw it. "You marked yourself," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter. The house accepted your offering. You've been named." "Named for what?" He didn't answer, but he pressed his hand to her chest, just above her heart, and whispered, "There's something living in here now, and it's not alone." The next day, the villagers stopped looking her in the eye. Children were pulled from her path, doors shut faster as she passed. Offerings once left for her grandmother's house were now placed at the base of the banyan tree, wrapped in black cloth instead of red. Fear had returned, not of some, but of Ling. At dusk, she found herself staring at her reflection again. The mirror in the hallway hadn't cracked, but the image it returned was no longer familiar. Her skin had taken on a faint pallor, not sickly, but smooth and cool, like porcelain left in the dark. Her eyes looked deeper, her pupils larger, and her breath no longer fogged the glass. But when she touched the mirror, it felt warm, almost like someone on the other side was touching it too. And then she saw it. A mark, faint but undeniable, just below her collarbone. Not a bruise, not a scar, but a tattoo made of thread, red, hand-stitched, pulsing slightly with her heartbeat. It formed the same spiral from the jar, a mark of completion, a sign that the seventh name had been accepted. She confronted the altar that night, sat before it in full silence, incense burning low, the air still and unmoving. "I didn't choose this," she whispered. The house didn't reply. "But I won't run." The sixth jar twitched. Lynn stared at it. "I saw you in my dreams, all of you." Her voice faltered. "And I think I understand now." The seventh jar gave a low hum, like something content, not satisfied, but at peace. That night, she dreamed of a wedding, not hers, not Sum's, but someone else's, faceless, featureless, floating through layers of silk and incense. At the altar stood 6 men. Each wore her name like a talisman around their necks. And in the center, she saw herself. But not as she was. This Ling was older, darker, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes clouded with secrets too old to speak out loud. She wore a smile that knew how to mourn and still keep moving. And on her back, embroidered into her robes, 7 names, threaded in blood, bound to her spine. She woke with a gasp, fingers tangled in red string, her skin slick with cold sweat. And beside her bed lay a single object, a needle threaded with black silk, its point stained with dried blood, and a note folded beneath it. In her own handwriting, "We don't bury love here. We bind it. We carry it until someone brave enough unravels the thread." She burned the note without hesitation. But she kept the needle, because deep inside, she knew what was coming next. The thread had chosen her, and the house had begun to grow again.
Before the jars, before the threads, before Lynn had a name that spirits whispered in the dark, there was a man, and he did not belong to the village. The elders of Phìn Lùng once spoke of him only in riddles. He came with no footsteps, no shadow. He walked the old road between the tea hills and the graves, his robes dark as leeches, his hat wide enough to hide both moonlight and intention. They called him many things: ghost seller, name thief, spirit weaver. But some called him something else: Tae Muk, the ink master. She had met him once, before Min,
before Tao, when she was young and angry and alone. He had found her in the woods, kneeling beside a tree she did not remember planting. She had been crying without sound, her palms torn open by sharp rocks, red thread tangled around her fingers from an offering that no one had answered. He stood just behind her, silent, until she turned and saw his mouth. It was stitched shut, but it moved. And when it did, the sound it made was not human. It was the sound of ink sliding across skin. Some spoke to him without words. Somehow, she knew how, and he understood. He pulled a scroll from his robes, black parchment that seemed to ripple like water, and with a single long fingernail he wrote on her tongue, not with ink, but with live worm blood. She did not scream. She did not pull away, because the moment the ink touched her flesh, she saw everything. Every jar, every name, every thread. She saw herself in red silk, standing at a cold altar. She saw a house without doors, filled with screaming walls. She saw her granddaughter. She saw the 7th jar. And she said, yes. He handed her the ritual, folded tight. Its final seal was blank, left unwritten, a space where only her name would fit. But he told her, if you read the last seal, you will not belong to your name anymore. It will belong to the jars forever. And then he placed the scroll in her hand and vanished. Some kept the scroll hidden for decades. She performed the rituals, bound the men, whispered their names, burned their bones with oil and ash and rose petals. She did everything, except open the last seal. She kept it buried in the forbidden room beneath the 7th effigy, wrapped in the wedding robe that she never wore. She convinced herself it was enough, that 6 would hold, that the 7th could remain empty. But even she knew, spells without endings rot. Back in the present, Lin found the scroll. She discovered it the night her breath no longer fogged the mirror, the night she realized the stitch beneath her skin was tightening. It was folded between layers of silk, dry but warm, as if it still pulsed with the man's voice. She unrolled it slowly, each glyph curled like a living thing. It was written in 2 hands, the first precise and sharp, the second trembling. The ritual was clear, 1 thread for each name, 1 jar for each soul, 1 bride to bind them all, and 1 name to seal the circle, not from the dead, but from the living. She reached the final seal. It was still blank, empty, waiting for her. That night, she dreamed of him, the ink master. He stood in her grandmother's house, but the walls were gone, the floor bled with red wax, jars hung from the ceiling like lanterns, and he smiled with a mouth full of thread. "Did you read it?" he asked, his voice liquid. Lin shook her head. He stepped closer, the scroll unraveling behind him in the air like smoke. "You must." "I don't want to belong to them." "You already do." "I want to end it." "Then write your name." He held out a needle dipped in something darker than blood. She hesitated, then asked, "What happens after 7?" He paused, and for the first time, he frowned. "There is no after, only holding, only echo, only the weight of what you carry forever." She woke with the needle in her hand. It was real, still warm, still dripping, and the scroll lay across her lap, the seal waiting, trembling. Lin lit every candle in the house. She placed each jar in a circle. Min, Dao, Tuan, Nam, Hu, Bao, and in the center, the 7th, still sealed, its surface marked with her heartbeat. She opened the scroll, took the needle, and wrote her name in the final space. Lin. The ink sank into the parchment. The candles flickered, and the jars began to weep. But the weeping was not sorrow, it was release. The 6th jar cracked and collapsed. The 5th let out a long exhale like lungs deflating. The 4th sang a single broken note on the wind. The others fell silent one by one until only the 7th remained whole. And the house went still. No breath, no chant, only Lin, alone, surrounded by ashes. And yet, she did not feel empty. She felt full, not haunted, but inhabited, loved, mourned, and finally, accepted. The ink master never returned, but the mark on her skin faded. The thread beneath her ribs loosened, and the mirror showed only herself. For now. Because some names are not just written, they are stitched. And some rituals wait generations to be finished.
The village shaman came at midnight, not because he wanted to, but because Lin summoned him. She sent a message tied with red thread and a sliver of fingernail, just as the old ways dictated, not to ask, but to warn. Tu arrived wrapped in black cloth and prayers. He carried a satchel of salt, ash, crushed bone, and thread dyed with crow blood. The moment he stepped into the house, the air grew tense, as if the walls themselves were watching. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at Lin and said, "It has you." She nodded once. "I know." They lit the altar fire with wax from the cracked 6th jar. They bound incense in braids of black hair, her hair. They placed 7 items on the altar: 1 tooth, 1 nail, 1 thread, 1 drop of ink, 1 scale from a snake, 1 petal from a grave blossom, and 1 name, her name, written in blood. "This is not an exorcism," Tu warned. "This is an offering." Lin nodded. "I don't want them cast out." He frowned. "Then what do you want?" Her voice trembled. "I want them to let me go." The ritual began with a chant, not in Vietnamese, not in Hong, but in a tongue that smelled of ink and dirt and old teeth. Tu poured salt in a wide circle, then added a ring of ground fingernails, sharpened offerings that were said to wound the dead just enough to make them listen. Lin knelt in the center. The
The jars hummed behind her, not with hunger, but anticipation. She felt it in her bones, a tension like string pulled too tight. And then the shaman spoke the binding words, old ones, not for banishing, but for negotiation. Spirits bound by thread, by name, by ash, hear the voice that carries blood of the binder. Hear the hand that sewed your silence. Come forward not in wrath, but in memory. The candles flickered, the jars wept, and from the ceiling above, threads began to fall, thin, red, endless. They hung like veins, pulsing gently. From each thread descended a shape, 6 of them. Not shadows, not corpses, but forms made of memory and longing. Each took the shape of the men Lin had seen in dreams: Min, Dao, Tun, Nam, Hu, and Bao. They stood around her, heads bowed, no longer angry, no longer lost, but still bound. Lin looked up at them. "Why do you stay?" Min stepped forward first. His voice was wind through hollow bamboo. "You called us." Dao, the herbalist, followed. "You mourned us." Dun, wrapped in faint firelight, said, "You carried our names." Nam whispered, "You bled for the jars." Hu added, "You sealed the 7th." And Bao, the silent one, finally said, "You loved us." Lin trembled. "I didn't know you." "But you do now," they replied in unison, "because we are inside you." Ung Tu threw a pinch of ash on the altar. "Do you want to be freed?" he demanded. The spirits looked at Lin, not at the shaman, only at her. She whispered, "I want to give you rest." They stepped back, and one by one placed an object into the fire. A flute, a dried flower, a burned ribbon, a tooth, a vial of ink, a glass bead. Each object hissed as it burned. Each flame turned black. And then Bao, the final spirit, placed a red thread into the fire. But it didn't burn. It glowed. And from its tip, a new thread emerged and wrapped around Lin's wrist. The fire roared. The shaman screamed, but Lin felt only warmth. Because the spirits were not being freed, they were sealing themselves into her, by choice, by ritual, by love. Ung Tu tried to stop it. He reached for the charm, but the jars shook violently, and the altar cracked. From underneath the floorboards came the sound none of them expected. A child's cry, soft, wet, incomplete. And Lin knew it was not a ghost. It was the 7th soul, not yet born, not yet dead. A soul that had never belonged to any of the 6. One that had waited between the jars, feeding on grief, on ritual, on her name. The shaman fell back, whispering prayers with blood on his lips. Lin stood. The red thread around her wrist now pulsed like a heartbeat. The spirits bowed their heads, and the house held its breath. She walked to the 7th jar, untied the spiral seal, lifted the lid. Inside was nothing but thread, tangled, endless. She placed her hand into the jar, and something took her fingers. Soft, small, like the hand of an infant, and a voice, barely formed, whispered from the depth, "Mother." She pulled her hand back. There was no blood, only soot and silence. But inside her, something had changed. A new name stirred, one that she had never heard, and one that she would never speak aloud. Because now the jars were sealed, the spirits held, and the house was whole. The shaman crawled away that night. He left without a word. He never returned. And from that day on, the village whispered not about some, but about the new widow who had bound the dead with her own name, not out of fear, but with thread and choice and love. The wedding was not announced. No drums, no guests, no laughter. Only the soft rustle of silk through dust and the quiet breath of a house preparing itself. The ceremony began at dusk, not outside under lanterns as tradition would have it, but deep inside the bones of the house, in the altar room, where the walls no longer creaked but listened. The seventh jar had been placed at the center of the room. Surrounding it 6 black candles, each burning low, each flame shaped like a hand. Ling didn't remember dressing, but when she looked down, she wore a robe she had never seen, deep crimson embroidered with gold thread that shimmered faintly in the dark. The patterns were not flowers or dragons. They were jars, 7 of them, stitched down the length of her back like vertebrae. Her feet moved without instruction, bare soles against cold wood. She stepped across a circle of salt and ash, passed between curtains of red thread hung from the ceiling like vines, and then she stood before it, the altar. But tonight it had changed. The photographs were gone. The incense bowls were empty, and in their place, laid in perfect symmetry, were 7 empty mirrors, each one facing her, each one reflecting a version of her face she had never seen, one smiling, one crying, one bloodied, one aged, one stitched, one blank, and one watching. The jar in the center pulsed, not with heat, but with presence. And then a voice, familiar and yet not, spoke from within it. Not loud, not soft, but final. Come forward, bride of thread, bearer of names, holder of echoes. Let the 7th be sealed by flesh. Ling stepped forward, and the air shifted. The candles bent inward, the mirrors darkened, the house closed. The 7 spirits appeared behind her. Min, Dao, Tuan, Nam, Hiao, Bao, each dressed in the garb of their final night, each bearing an offering in their hands, remnants of who they were. A music box, a dried flower crown, a letter, a broken ring, a small book of prayers, and a jar. Her jar, still sealed, still waiting. The spirit of Men stepped forward first. He placed his hand on her shoulder. You carried us when we had no bodies. Dao followed. You mourned what you never knew. Then Tuan, you sang the names we forgot. Nam, you became the altar. Hiao, you did not run. Bao, you opened the door. And then the jar. It opened without touch, and from it rose a shape, not a man, not a child, not a ghost, but something made entirely of thread and longing. It had no bones, it had no face, but it had a voice, and it spoke in her voice. Bride of the broken seal, will you carry us in full? Ling swallowed her throat. Her hands trembled. She did not answer with words. She knelt and extended both hands. The shape entered her, not through pain, but through silence. It flowed into her palms, her chest, her mouth, her spine. It stitched itself along her ribs, braided itself into her nerves, sank gently into her heartbeat. And when it was done, Ling opened her eyes and saw nothing. Not because she was blind, but because she no longer needed sight to know where they were. The house was inside her now. The jars, the names, the voices, the ritual, complete, whole, married. Outside, the wind began to howl. The bamboo grove groaned, and the villagers, though they didn't know why, lit their lanterns early and spoke in hushed tones, because the air had shifted, not with fear, but with presence. The feeling that something old had finally settled. Ling rose from the altar floor. Her robe now trailed in ash. The mirrors no longer reflected her, only the threads, red, endless, alive. She stepped past the jar, now empty, past the spirits, now bowed, and into the hallway where her reflection finally smiled in time with her face. She was not haunted anymore. She was inhabited. And in her chest, the seventh name beat softly like a lullaby made of silk. Ling, the bride of silence, the bride of thread, the boneless widow of Phìn Lùng.
The house had grown too quiet. No more whispers, no more rattling jars, no more footsteps behind closed doors. Only stillness, thick, breathless, like the moment before a scream. Lin no longer felt human. She moved like smoke. She ate, but didn't taste. She slept, but didn't dream. The robe clung to her skin now, even when she tried to remove it. The threads had woven themselves into the seams of her spine. She could feel the weight of 7 names with every breath. Ming, Dao, Tuan, Nam, Hiao, Bao, and the final, unspoken one, hers. She had become the seal, and the house no longer belonged to some. It belonged to her. But then the spirits changed. At first, they appeared only at night, gentle, watchful, echoing their usual gestures of love and mourning. Then they began to touch, not softly, not lovingly, but with urgency. Ming's hand gripped her wrist, pulling her toward the altar. Tuan whispered in her ear, but the words were not his own. Nam stood behind her in the mirror, no longer weeping, but smiling. And in the corners of the house, something new stirred, something without a name, something not one of the 6. That night, the 7th jar began to move. Not vibrate, move. It shifted on its own, sliding across the floorboards like it had grown legs beneath the clay. It circled the altar, then the door, then her bed.
Lin followed it in silence, until it rolled to a stop before the forbidden room. The door opened without sound, and inside the effigies were gone, all 7. Only the cracked mirror remained, and in it, Lin saw her reflection, bound in thread, eyes black, mouth sewn shut. Behind her, some stood once more, but she was not alive, not fully. You took what I could not finish. You sealed what I could not bear. Lin stepped back. You gave me to them. No, some said. I prepared you, but you gave yourself. The jars trembled behind them. The altar cracked. The house is not complete, not until something is broken. And Lin understood. The ritual had never been about containment. It had been about replacement. Someone had to become the altar. Someone had to hold the weight of the 7. And Lin was tired. She returned to the altar, placed all 7 jars in a circle. One by one, she unsealed them. The air grew thick, the house groaned, the lights dimmed, and the spirits came. Not as men, not as memory, but as threads, living strands of longing and regret, of promises made and broken. They wrapped around her arms, her neck, her chest. They whispered, "Be the jar, be the seal, be the house." And Lin, heart burning, reached for the oil lamp. She stood above the altar and whispered, "No more," then dropped the flame. The fire moved like it had been waiting. It didn't spread, it consumed. The jars cracked, the walls bled soot, the thread writhed and shrieked. The spirit screamed her name, all 7, over and over, louder, desperate. Lin, Lin, Lin. But she did not stop. She took the charm from Ontu's satchel, the last one he had given her, and smashed it against the floor. The sound tore through the air like thunder. The altar split in half, and the fire swallowed the names. She awoke on the ground. The fire was gone. The room was ash. The house broken. No walls, no roof, just beams charred black and silence thick as smoke. The jars were dust, the mirrors were shattered, and in her lap lay a single thread, red, unburned, still warm, still alive. She walked from the ruins barefoot. The villagers watched in silence. No one spoke, no one followed. They simply bowed their heads, because they knew the house was gone, but the spirit remained. That night, she slept under the banyan tree, alone. And when the wind passed through the leaves, it whispered only one name, her own, but softly, not as a curse, not as a claim, but as a memory. And for the first time in weeks, Lin did not answer. The house was gone, reduced to cinders and scorched bones of timber, the altar, ashes, the jars, silent. But the 7th jar remained. It had not burned, it had not cracked, it had not even blackened. Lin found it the next morning, half buried in the earth beneath the banyan tree, unmarked, unbroken, waiting. Its surface was cool and smooth, no longer etched with thread or names. Just one symbol now, carved so faintly she nearly missed it. A mirror. Not a literal one, not glass, but something symbolic. A reminder that what the jar truly held was her. She picked it up and felt nothing at first. No warmth, no hum, no spirits curling inside. Just silence. And then, a voice. Not from around her, from within her. Soft, regretful, her own. We never wanted a vessel. We wanted a witness. The world tilted. Lynn dropped to her knees because she finally understood. The jar had never been hungry. It had been full of memory, of ritual, of names passed down like heirlooms, not to be sealed, but to be remembered. She carried the jar back to the ruins, stepped over the burned threshold, stood in the place where the altar once stood. And for the first time, she did not weep. Instead, she sat cross-legged in the soot and placed the jar before her. Then she did something her grandmother never dared. She opened it. Nothing emerged. No smoke, no thread, no ghost. Only air, and the soft smell of lotus and ash. And at the bottom, nestled like a seed, was a single piece of folded silk, tiny, fragile. She lifted it out with shaking hands and unfurled it. It was a letter, written in trembling ink, not from the spirits, not from the shaman, but from Sem. To the one who finishes the circle, I tried to contain what was meant to be carried. I tried to bind what was meant to be remembered. I thought love could be held in clay. But you walked with them. You listened. You saw me. And now, because of you, they are free. You don't need to carry them. But if you ever feel alone, just listen, and they'll hum in your bones again. Lynn folded the silk and placed it back into the jar. She whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time, the wind in the trees sounded like laughter. She left the ruins behind, took only the jar, walked down the mountain path as morning bloomed through the fog. The villagers watched. They did not speak, but one by one they placed offerings on her path. A red thread, a sprig of wormwood, a folded paper crane, a dried petal, a single coin, old tokens, symbols of respect, not out of fear, but reverence, because they knew the story now, and stories once remembered do not haunt, they guide. That night, Lynn sat by the river. Moonlight spilled across the water like thread. She set the jar beside her and whispered each name again. Ming, Dao, Tuan, Nam, Hugh, Bao, and then paused before the final one. Then she spoke it. Len. Not as a curse, not as a title, but as a promise. To remember, to carry lightly, to never bind love again in jars or ash or thread. She placed the lid back on the seventh jar, not sealed, just closed, and set it gently into the water. The current carried it slowly, calmly into the dark. It did not sink, it did not tip. It simply floated forward as if it knew the way. And behind it, the air shifted, not cold, not haunted, just still and full of peace.
Years passed. The house was never rebuilt. Its foundation remained a ring of blackened stone, choked by vines and silence. The villagers avoided the hilltop trail now, not out of fear, but something else, respect. Because they remembered the fire and the girl who walked away from it. They still called her Lin, but never to her face. To the old, she was Guiju Loi, the one who kept the names. To the children, she was Ba Soi Da, the red thread woman, whose shadow sometimes flickered with extra arms. And to the grieving, she was known simply as the new widow, not because she had lost a husband, but because she carried the memory of 7. She never married. She lived at the edge of the forest in a quiet wooden house where wind chimes made from bones sang soft lullabies when the night was still. She spoke little, but when she did, it was always in truth. She told the stories no one else remembered, of a man who died sinning, of another who burned for love, of hands that stitched silence into clay. She never said their names aloud anymore, but the villagers whispered them into the smoke of their cooking fires, hoping she might hear and carry them safely. And sometimes she did. She kept a box beneath her bed, not locked, not hidden, just closed. Inside were 7 objects: a flute without strings, a wedding ribbon singed at the edge, a bundle of pressed grave blossoms, a rusted ring, a book of prayers with missing pages, a tiny jar filled with red thread, and a folded piece of silk written in ink faded to gray. She never opened it. She didn't need to. She knew every word by heart. Sometimes the children would sneak up the hill, daring each other to knock on her door. She always answered, and she always smiled. She gave them candied lotus, or bitter tea, or small dolls sewn from cloth and rice husk. But never faces, never names, only thread. And when they asked her why the dolls had no mouths, she would say, "Some stories are better whispered from within." One summer, a young woman came to her door. Her eyes were red. Her hands were shaking. "I lost my brother. He died alone. No one came to his funeral." Lin nodded and handed her a needle. "Then make something with his name stitched inside, not for him, but for you." The woman wept, and Lin held her quietly until the tears passed. Because she knew, love that is bound too tightly becomes a wound, but love remembered, that becomes a thread. And threads, when left untied, carry forward. That night, Lin stood beneath the banyan tree once more. The river flowed quietly below. The 7th jar had long since vanished into its current, but she still listened for it sometimes, and in the hush between the wind and the leaves, she often heard nothing. But occasionally, when the moon was high and the air was still, she heard her name again, not as a scream, not as a chant, but as a breath, a thank you, from the ones she carried, from the ones she freed, from the one she had become. She turned to leave the tree, but before she did, She tied a single red thread around its trunk. No knots, no names, just a thread. And it fluttered in the wind like a goodbye that didn't need to be spoken. And so the story ends, not in horror, not in silence, but in memory, in the echo of footsteps that no longer haunt, in jars that no longer weep, in names that live not in altars, but in the breath of a girl who chose to listen, and in a house long gone, where once, long ago, a woman became a widow not through loss, but through love remembered too well.